We hear many wonderful Signs of the Times talks at Bible school, and rightly so, as we consider the events that take place in the world round about us with the Bible in hand. Well, this evening we're going to step back in time, and we're going to think of an event which took place, which at that time, for those who had eyes to see and ears to hear, was the most wonderful demonstration of the Father's hand at work in the nations, saving his people. Now, I appreciate that not everybody in the room is going to be able to do this, but for those of you who can, cast your minds back to 1976. Those of you who can't, don't worry, this is what went on. So, a few headlines. Concorde, okay? That the first ever commercial flight of Concorde took place in 1976. The National Exhibition Centre in Birmingham was opened by the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh. The Ford Fiesta was launched. Here we have a Ford Fiesta Mark I. I want you to notice the beautiful cream and brown paintwork, daringly modern at the time. Harold Wilson resigned as Prime Minister, was replaced by James Callaghan. There were the most severe droughts on record, standpipes in the streets and people filling up buckets. And this man died. Anybody care to tell me who that is? It is indeed L.S. Lowry. Not my cup of tea, but there we are. There are those that love his work. In the wider world, the Apple Computer Company was founded. Thank you. In the United States, Jimmy Carter won the presidential election, beating Gerald Ford. At the Montreal Olympics, 14-year-old Romanian gymnast Nadia Comaneci won 5 gold medals, including on the uneven bars, where she scored 10 out of 10. Nobody had ever done that up until that point. Fidel Castro became president of Cuba, and this gentleman died. Anybody care to guess? Howard Hughes, the American billionaire. However, there was one incident which captured the attention of the Christadelphian community because they could see God working with his people. In early July 1976, Israeli forces flew to Entebbe in Uganda for a daring, almost impossible mission to rescue Israeli and Jewish hostages captured by Islamic and German terrorists. Now, this event is rarely spoken of within our community today, but it is truly one of the most astonishing events in recent years. And with the Bible in hand, it is far more than just an amazing military operation to rescue a few people. It is a glorious demonstration of God working in the lives of his people. Sometimes known as Operation Thunder, Operation Thunderbolt, or for reasons that will become clear later, Operation Jonathan. That's not why I chose it. This particular writer, Saul David, called it the most audacious hostage rescue mission in history. And I would agree. Various books have been written. I've got a couple of these, I think, certainly the one. If anybody wants to borrow it, come and see me. And films have been made. Again, I've got both of these on DVD. You're welcome to borrow them. Not because I'm old-fashioned. I think the original is much better. But there we are. Now, why are we considering this evening? Is it because we are bloodthirsty, that we like seeing people die? Nothing could be further from the truth. We desire peace. Nor is it because we are political in a worldly sense, or we believe that terrorists are receiving the punishment that's worthy of their crimes. Again, the opposite is true. We are considering this quite simply because of the involvement of God's people, Israel, the Jews. And the Bible is very clear. Although some, perhaps many within Israel, do not acknowledge or serve their God, certainly do not acknowledge the Lord Jesus as their Saviour, they are still his people, and without question, they are special because of it. Zechariah 2 verse 8, for thus saith the Lord of hosts, after the glory hath he sent me unto the nations which spoiled you, for he that toucheth you, Israel, he that toucheth you, toucheth the apple of his eye, the pupil. There are few more sensitive places in the human body. I could get a splinter in my finger and forget about it for a day or two. Ultimately, I've got to deal with it, but it's not going to stop me doing my job. If I get a splinter in my eye, that is very serious. That's how important this is. This is the love of Yahweh for his people. Ah, yes, but that's the Old Testament. It all changed when Jesus came. There are those outside of our community, professing Christians, and very sadly, tragically, sometimes within our community, who question whether Israel are still God's people. There is no question here. Hath God cast away his people? By no means. God hath not cast away his people whom he foreknew, says the Apostle Paul. And that's not talking about spiritual Israel. There is no question about it. Romans 11 is about Israel after the flesh. Well, let's consider this event then with the Bible in hand. How can we see God's hand at work, and what are the lessons for you and me? We begin then on the 27th of June 1976 with this aeroplane, an Air France A300 Airbus that departed from Tel Aviv with 246 mainly Jewish or Israeli passengers on board. It flew to Athens, where a further 58 additional passengers boarded. Departing for Paris almost immediately, it was hijacked by 3 men and 1 woman. 2 of the 4 hijackers were from the PLO, Palestinians, and the other 2 were Germans. Now, we may ask the question, how was it so easy to sneak the necessary weapons that they had on board so that they could hijack the plane? And there are 2 reasons. Firstly, because there was a strike at that day amongst the civil aviation employees. Everything was in chaos. And the second reason, quite simply, this was Athens. This was Athens. This is the old airport at Athens. And one Israeli passenger who had passed through declared this. Had the terrorists wanted to take aboard the plane 2 Lance missiles and an armoured troop carrier, they could have done so without any difficulty. The only counteraction by the Greek aviation people would perhaps have been to ask them to pay excess baggage charges. So was this an isolated act? By no means. Between 1968 and 1976, there had been 29 acts of hijacking or hits at Israeli aircraft. Many lives were lost during these events. Well, initially the plane, having taken off from Tel Aviv and landing at Athens, it then took off, immediately was hijacked, and then it was flown to Libya, Benghazi, and refueled, remaining there on the runway in the baking heat for 7 long hours. One hostage, British woman who was pregnant, she was released. The plane was then flown southeast to Uganda, arriving at Entebbe airport there in that country more than 24 hours after its initial departure from Tel Aviv. At this point, one other man steps into the scene. Amin. What do we know then of him? President of Uganda from 1971 to 1979. In fact, he'd grown up in poverty. He joined the British Army as a cook before rising through the ranks. In 1962, Uganda gained independence from the UK, and Amin joined the Ugandan army, attaining the position of Commander of the Armed Forces in 1970. On the 25th of January 1971, he seized power in a military coup. But his rule was one of barbarity, characterised by rampant human rights abuses. It is estimated Up to 500,000 of his opponents were executed during this time. Finally, he was ousted in 1979. Fleeing the country, he died in exile in Saudi Arabia in 2003. One of his many nicknames, the Black Hitler. But here is the great irony. The people of Israel had been very good to Idi Amin. Contrary to his wish, his portrayal as a man wishing to bring a peaceful conclusion to these events, he clearly saw this as an opportunity to be the centre of attention. He was quite simply a self-obsessed control freak, and he loved having the eyes of the world on him. Once at Entebbe, the hijackers were joined by 4 others, men from Amin's army. The captives were transferred to a transit hall of the former airport's terminal. And conditions there were basic in the extreme. The food was horrendous quality, the water was filthy, and initially they had to sleep on the floor. The hijackers then presented their demands. They wanted 53 Palestinian militants, 40 of whom were in jail in Israel, to be released, and they threatened if their demands were not met, they would start executing their hostages on the 1st of July. Well, on the 29th of June, the hostages were divided into 2 groups. Those who were Israeli or Jewish on the one side, and those who were not on the others. Those with dual citizenship were placed with the Jews, with the Israelis. And yet the group was divided. Those of Israel, or with a connection to Israel, and those who were none. And this, of course, is highly scriptural. I want you to look, please, at Isaiah 43. You are mine, says God, verse 1. Verse 2, when thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee. Through the rivers, they shall not overflow thee. When thou walkest through the fire. We think of Daniel chapter 3. Thou shalt not be burned, neither shall the flame kindle upon thee. Verse 4, since thou wast precious in my sight, thou hast been honourable, and I have loved thee. Therefore I will give men for thee, and people for thy life. Israel, whether natural or spiritual, are God's people. They are special in his sight. And yet, yes indeed, in 1976, men would be given for Israel's life. Verse 6, I will say to the north, give up, to the south, keep not back. Bring my sons from far, my daughters from the ends of the earth. And while this speaks of a literal regathering, as in Nehemiah's day or 1948, or indeed the millennial regathering which is yet to take place, the fact remains, when Israel's God demands that his people must be released, that is what happens. It happened in Babylon, it happened in Egypt, and this principle and his love is unchanged to this very day. Well, on the 30th of June, 48 non-Israeli hostages were freed. After the Israeli government gave an assurance that they were willing to negotiate, a further 100 non-Israeli captives were released. Those who remained were the flight crew, who very commendably refused to depart, around 10 French and 84 Israelis. Over the coming days, unsurprisingly, there was very much discussion amongst the Israeli politicians. Many believed that the government was willing to release some prisoners in return for the release of the hostages. However, I was going to say conveniently, we can't use that word, but this man living in Israel, Haim Baruch Bar-Lev, steps onto the scene at this point. He had known Idi Amin for very many years. In fact, he'd helped in the training of the Ugandan army. He'd lived in Uganda for 5 years. He'd met Amin when he was still a junior in the army. Idi Amin suffered pains in his feet and his ankles, and Bar-Lev suggested to him, well, visit Israel and bathe there in the Dead Sea, in the sulfur baths at Tiberias. And that's what he did. He put him in touch with an Israeli doctor who said, although his malady couldn't be cured, it could be slowed by treatment, by diet. And Amin was very grateful for the help that he received. These two men knew each other. Amin regarded him as his friend. Here's a photograph of the two of them together at a meal in Tel Aviv in 1971. Interestingly, Bar-Lev had done more than just assist Amin in matters relating to his health. You see, the former president of Uganda, a man by the name of Milton Obote, had been very anti-Israel and anti-Amin. He wanted him dead. And knowing what Obote had planned, Bar-Lev had been able to assist Amin and spare him from a trial and potentially from prison. He advised him to form a paramilitary group, ready to defend himself in case Obote tried to kill him, and this he did. And so when Amin seized power, this unit was able to support him. I rather suspect it didn't take long for Bar-Lev to realise, once Amin came to power, that he had befriended a vile and unpredictable man. But this friendship between these two men would prove vital during hostage negotiations. How beneficial, brothers and sisters, that Israel should have a man there at that time able to negotiate with a despot like Amin. Surely the hand of God at work. There's another great irony in this. You see, the Israeli military had been very generous in training the Ugandan Air Force. For many years, the Ugandans depended on Israel alone until they made the decision to turn against them and turn to the USSR. This is how they thanked them. During the days after the plane arrived at Uganda, Bar-Lev spoke to Amin on the phone many times. He even talked of going to see him in Uganda. And though Amin was polite, he always called him his friend. He clearly enjoyed holding sway. Bar-Lev repeatedly pleaded with him to play the part of the peacemaker, stressing that as president of Uganda, he had power to overcome the terrorists and set the hostages free. The world would see then what a great man he was. These pleas fell on deaf ears. On another occasion, Bar-Lev said, remember what your mother said, President Amin. Remember what your mother said to you. Help the Israelis from the Holy Land. Like all other requests, this was ignored. Amin clearly lied about the number of terrorists. He also claimed that the airport was surrounded by explosives, so you'll never fly anybody in. Another lie. The only thing that Bar-Lev could do was buy time. The initial deadline, when the terrorists said they would blow up the plane and start killing the hostages, that came and went, and a new deadline of the 4th of July was agreed. All sorts of diplomatic suggestions came to nothing. Various statesmen, various leaders and ambassadors were involved. When Israel appeared to be willing to comply, the terrorists changed their demands. They said that every single prisoner had to be released, not just the 40 in Israel, but the other 13 held in Germany, Switzerland or Kenya. And even then, when Israel appeared to be willing to comply, the terrorists changed their minds and stated yet more prisoners had to be released, and in fact we want $5 million. When it became apparent that all attempts at a diplomatic solution would fail, Israel decided they had to act. In fact, as soon as the plane had landed in Uganda, plans were put in place. The plan was very simple. It was also as dangerous as it was daring. They would fly a small number of soldiers in, rescue the hostages, and get them out as quickly as possible. They knew they had to refuel the planes, and so an arrangement was made, and they would do so in Kenya. In preparing for the raid, Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency needed to know as much as they possibly could about the site. And again, two astonishing events helped them. The first one is this. One of the freed hostages had a military background and an astonishing memory, almost photographic memory. And he was able to help the Israelis in planning for the raids, in describing what the airport was like. They built a scale model. So accurate was it. The way the doors opened on the terminal was correct. Secondly, Israeli firms had been used to construct many buildings in Africa in the 1960s and 1970s, one of them being the old airport terminal at Entebbe. And again, Mossad was able to interview those involved, and again, it helped them in creating this scale model. Once again, we see the Father's hand at work. One further vital piece of information was revealed by those who were released, and that is that the Ugandan soldiers were totally complicit in these events. Despite Amin's posturing as a peacemaker, they were allied with the Germans and the Palestinians. And so it was that the Israeli government, with full support of the opposition, decided to act. This was the plan. A task force numbering around 100 would fly to Uganda, divided into various groups. 29 would lead the assault on the terminal building, securing the hostages. They were led by this man, Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Netanyahu, whose brother would later become the Prime Minister of the country. So highly was this man regarded by his men. They said this: if Yoni goes with us, there's no fear of defeat. Well, they took off from Sharm el-Sheikh, the task force flying down the Red Sea, interesting location, where possible flying lower than 100 feet to avoid detection by radar, Egyptian and other countries. At the bottom of the Red Sea, they turned right, flying over Kenya, Ethiopia, and finally they arrived at Entebbe. One option had been to land on Lake Victoria, which bordered the airport, and then reach the shore by boats, but they discovered that Lake Victoria was known for its high proliferation of crocodiles, and so they put that one to bed. One of the planes was a Boeing 707. It had landed at Nairobi in neighbouring Kenya. That was effectively a flying hospital. They were expecting many casualties. Another Boeing circled above, transmitting information to those on the ground and back to Israel. Of the 4 cargo planes, one landed with its cargo bay doors already open at 1 minute after midnight. An appropriate time? Absolutely an appropriate time. We think of the Passover, we think of Samson at Gaza, we think of the coming of the bridegroom at midnight. And what about these words from Job 34? In a moment they shall die, the people shall be troubled at midnight and pass away, and the mighty shall be taken away without hand. Isn't that exactly what happened? All the military might of Uganda was powerless against Israel's guard that night. The Israelis even took with them a black Mercedes and Land Rovers to distract the Ugandan guards. It was known that Amin drove a Mercedes, and they planned that the guards would be deceived into believing that this was Amin, come to expect the hostages. The commandos even wore mock Ugandan army uniforms. This is the old terminal that was intact in 1994. You might just about be able to make out the bullet holes are still there from the raid. Shortly after the first plane landed, 2 more cargo planes also arrived. Although once the Ugandan guards realised what was going on, they killed the power. So a 3rd plane had to land by moonlight. We can only assume it must have been a very clear and bright night. Another blessing from the Father. Why was the first landing not detected? There are various ideas. Maybe the Ugandans were just negligent. Maybe Israel had some sort of radar blocking system. Whatever the answer, we have to say once again, the Father's hand was at work. Regrettably, one of the sentries knew that the president had recently changed his Mercedes from a black one to a white one. That forced the Israelis' hands. They killed the two sentries and approached the terminal straight away. Leaving their vehicles, the soldiers ran to the airport building. They entered the terminal and through a megaphone, they shouted in English and in Hebrew, "Stay down, stay down, we are Israeli soldiers." Amazingly, in the crossfire that followed, there were very few hostages hurt. One of the terrorists was shot dead immediately. One of the Israeli soldiers, noting that only one had been killed, called out in Hebrew, "Where's the rest of them?" The hostages pointed to a connecting door. They threw several hand grenades in, entered, and shot dead those that were there. The other cargo planes had now landed and they unloaded armoured personnel carriers to provide defence during the raid. You would expect during any sort of activity like this that many Israeli soldiers would be lost. In fact, only one died during the raid. We'll come back to that later. One man who was there that day, Flight Sergeant Amin Officer, said this: "The glass was broken by someone shooting automatic gunfire at me. The bullets flashed, one to the right, one to the left, one beneath my legs, one behind my legs, one past my left ear. It was amazing." Amazing, brothers and sisters? Miraculous. The Father's hand was at work. Come to Isaiah 54 that we read earlier. Why was this man not hit? Why were so few of them hit? Because God was blessing his people. Now, primarily, this is a kingdom prophecy. There is no question about that. So we have a contrast with the barren state in verse 1, when Israel will be fruitful. But let's just pick up a couple of key points. Verse 5, "For thy Maker is thine husband, Yahweh of hosts is his name, and thy Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel, the God of the whole earth, shall he be called." And yes, he's not the God of the whole earth yet, though the whole earth is his. One day he will be known by all. Verse 15, "Behold, they shall surely gather together, but not by me. Whosoever shall gather against thee shall fall for thy sake." As enemies fell in Bible times, from Egypt to Assyria and Babylon, so modern day enemies, Adolf Hitler, Idi Amin, Saddam Hussein, they have come to nothing. Verse 17, "No weapon that is formed against thee shall prosper, and every tongue that shall rise against thee in judgment thou shalt condemn. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord. Their righteousness is of me, saith the Lord." It's of him. It's not their own righteousness. No weapon that is formed shall prosper. Ultimately, yes, there may be victories along the way. Yes, indeed, Jews have died. Of course they have. And we know the horrors that were suffered in the Holocaust. But ultimately, the Father's plan and purpose with his people will be done. They will be preserved. Israel will not be wiped off the map, no matter what men might plan. And the Ugandans' weapons that day, the terrorist guns, were to prove utterly, utterly useless. Some words from one of the hostages, a gentleman by the name of Ilan Hartouf. He said this: "We heard shooting and saw what looked like trace of fire. We realized someone was shooting at the terrorists. We didn't know who it was. Then the soldiers started pouring in, although they were dressed like Ugandans. I said it was the Sahel, the Israeli army. And everyone started shouting, 'Ness, Ness, miracle!' When the Israelis arrived, we couldn't believe it. We talked a lot about the possibility. We even had 2 reserve colonels from the Israeli Air Force among us who said it couldn't be done." Again, notice the word miracle. This was a miraculous event. because that is how Israel's God works. Like David against Goliath, like Gideon's 300 against the Midianites, or Samson's slaying of 1,000 men with the jawbone of an ass. What do we really read in Leviticus 26? 5 of you shall chase 100, and 100 of you shall put 10,000 to flight. Your enemies shall fall before you by the sword. And they did, and they did. The surviving hijacker, this gentleman, Wilfred Boerse, realizing what was happening, made his way to one of the halls where the hostages were fled. And he raised his gun, ready to kill them. Amazingly, he turned around, ran outside and started firing at the Israeli soldiers, and within seconds he was dead. Why did he not kill the hostages as he said he would? Why did he not use them as a human shield to secure his own safety? It's impossible to say, except that once again we can see God's hand at work, preserving his people. It had taken just 45 seconds to locate and kill the 4 hijackers. That has to be regarded as ruthlessly efficient. The hostages were then led out to the aircraft. Ugandan soldiers realized what was happening. They shot at them from the control tower. 5 Israeli soldiers were wounded. 1, Jonathan Netanyahu, lost his life. The hostages were then loaded onto the planes together with Netanyahu's body, and they took off. As the hostages ran outside, some noted that the Israeli soldiers screened them, quote, like a living wall. Now, what does that take us back to? Surely the Exodus. The children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground. The waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left. This, like the return in 1948, was another Exodus, was it not? Emma Rosenkrantz, a Jewess and resident from Jerusalem, described the soldiers as arriving like an angel from heaven, she said. As one of the soldiers appeared at the door of the hall where they had been held, he simply said calmly, "I'm from Israel. Dress at once. We're taking you home." The entire operation was to last 53 minutes, 2 minutes less than the dress rehearsal in Israel the previous day. The actual assault lasted only 30 minutes. All of the hijackers were killed, plus around 45 Ugandan soldiers. Of the 106 hostages, 3 died. 1 was left behind. Approximately 10 were wounded. As the operation was wound up, a number of Israeli soldiers crossed the runway to where a line of Ugandan MiG fighters were parked, destroying them with gunfire, grenades and explosives. And still they weren't finished. They also planted delayed action bombs around the site. Explosions were heard for many hours, well after the Israeli planes had soared away to freedom. It is said that 1/4 of the Ugandan Air Force was destroyed that night. The Israeli planes then flew to Nairobi in Kenya, where refueling took place. In a matter of hours, they landed back in Israel safely. No Ugandan planes followed them, and unsurprisingly, they received a hero's welcome back in Israel. We're not going to dwell on the outcome at any great length, except to note with great sadness the one Israeli hostage that was left behind. This lady, Dora Bloch, who also had British citizenship. She'd been taken to hospital when she choked on a chicken bone. She was murdered there, as it is claimed were some of the doctors and nurses who tried to intervene. Many more Ugandans lost their lives in the aftermath. Some had to flee for fear of reprisals by the Ugandan authorities. What was the outcome for Amin? Less than 3 years after the raid, he was deposed. As noted earlier, he fled the country. He died in exile in 2003. He had seemed untouchable for so long, but he dared to rise against God's people And this is what the Father said to the father of the nation, Abraham. I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. Idi Amin, you are cursed for what you did. In thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. A couple of brief points regarding the date. The date of the raid was the 4th of July 1976, and many have noted it's the same date, in fact 200 years to the day from the declaration of independence of the United States, Israel's big ally. 40 years after the raid, the then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visited Entebbe with an Israeli delegation and laid groundwork for further development of Israeli sub-Saharan bilateral relations. Now, what are the lessons? What are the lessons for you and me from these things? It seems so long ago, unlikely perhaps that we will be as moved as some might have been at the time. But you know, like the return to the land in 1948, like the Six-Day War, we should be moved as we see the Father's hand at work in these things. My father-in-law, a lovely, lovely brother who fell asleep 28 years ago, told me that he went to bed on Saturday night wondering what was going to happen. Got up on Sunday, went downstairs, put the radio on, heard the news, and he raced back upstairs to his wife, my mother-in-law. They've done it! Yes! They've got them out! I say again, we don't glory in bloodshed. We don't, but we do rejoice when we see the Father's hand at work in the lives of his people as foretold in his word. And we look to the time when all Israel will be saved. 2 final references. When the Israeli cabinet discussed what they should do, one man, the Interior Minister, Joseph Berg, a devout believer in Scripture, quoted this passage. The Lord hearkened to the voice of Israel and delivered at the Canaanites, and they utterly destroyed them in their cities, and he called the name of the place Hormah, which means devoted. Oh, that we might call Entebbe Hormah, he said, devoted to our God. How many acknowledge God's hand at work in Israel to this day? How many give him glory? How many accept Jesus as their Messiah? Of course, there were those who did acknowledge God's hand at work there in Israel. As they took off into the night sky, one soldier turned to his companion and he commented, "They know that we didn't come on the wings of the Shekinah alone." Isn't that absolutely beautiful? Psalm 149, please. Psalm 149. Beautiful psalm of all that the Father will do one day when, verse 2, the children of Zion will be joyful in their King. It will happen when, end of verse 4, he will beautify the meek with salvation. Isn't that gorgeous? And what about you and me? What about the saints? Verse 5, let the saints be joyful in glory. Let them sing aloud upon their beds. We should rejoice when we see his hand at work. Absolutely. What about our work in the age to come by grace? What will we do? What will we do? Verse 6, let the high praises of God be in their mouth and a two-edged sword in their hand. Not literal, symbolic. But what will we do with this symbolic sword? Verse 7, to execute vengeance upon the heathen and punishments upon the people, to bind their kings with chains, their nobles with fetters of iron, to execute upon them the judgment written. This honor have all his saints. Hallelujah. This is our honor brothers and sisters. This is our privilege in the age to come. Not because we want to shed the blood of pagans. Not because we take pleasure in destruction of those who dare to oppose us. But because we want to cleanse this planet, glorify our God, serve his Son, save his people. This is our future by grace. One day, we know from Deuteronomy 28, Israel will be the head and no more the tail. One day, the world will be changed. And our future, in the mercy of the Father, is spelt out in verses like this, by grace. This honour have all his saints. Now, brothers and sisters, we may well be very close to midnight. The divine clock is ticking. Are we ready for the call? Because this is the honour that awaits us. If we can remain true to him, if we can see his hand at work in the events of the nations and apply the lessons in our lives day by day. Thank you.